Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Catapult's Thinking Differently series. Today's conversation is one that is timely, important, and complex and integrated across many layers within organizations and our society. And we're delighted to have some wonderful panelists as we think differently about celebrating diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. I'm Dr. Cheryl Richards, the CEO of Catapult, which is your statewide employers association. At Catapult, our mission is to provide employers with the confidence to navigate everyday operational challenges, making workplaces more effective and employees more successful. And today's program on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace will provide some timely tips, some thoughtful conversation, and hopefully allow you to think differently about navigating some of the organizational challenges so that you and your organizations can be more effective, as can your employees be more successful. Let me start by introducing our guest speakers and panelists today. First is Kamala Emanuel. Kamala is a founder and certified executive coach in Keep Evolving Consulting. They provide executive coaching, HR consulting, and diversity and inclusion. So Kamala, thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Certrice. Here comes Certrice Grice. Certrice is an industrial organizational psychologist and chief consulting officer and co-founder of Mattingly Solutions. Her expertise is in DE&I diagnostics, organizational service design, behavioral change intervention, and DEIX program evaluation, which we'll hear a little bit more of later in our program today. So Certrice, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thanks.
All right, we're going to jump into our content this morning and start with a very basic question, although I think it might have a complex answer to it. And so I'd like to start with, what is diversity? What is diversity and what isn't? Kamala, would you like to kick us off with your thoughts?
Absolutely. So good morning, everyone. Great question. What is diversity? So the first thing I'm going to say is diversity is way more than representation. While representation is important, it's just more complex than that. So I like to kick off with what diversity isn't. It isn't about separation. It isn't about offering people a hand up. It's about creating an infusion of perspectives and enhancing employee engagement. So it refers to human differences, social identities, sex, gender, identity, sexual identity, language, culture. An infusion of all of those perspectives bring together a enhanced and engaged workplace. And that really is what I would say the foundation of diversity is.
Wonderful, yeah. Thank you. Certrice, would you like to add to that your perspective of what diversity is and what it isn't?
Yeah, I want to tag on to what you were saying there, and that's I think something else that it gets confused with is diversity is not anti-racism, right? It's part of the conversation, but that's a very different targeted conversation. And so when you are using that term diversity broadly, you are covering all of the bases. You're touching on all identities and experiences. I apologize. I'm in a co-working space and there are some weird power issues happening. So if the light keeps turning off and on, it's startling to me, and I apologize if it startled you. But back to this. So yeah, I feel like so often people use the term diversity as a code word, especially in America, to talk about the differences between Black people and white people. And that's not the whole picture. Again, while it is a major part of it, especially in the US, it's not the whole thing. And so it's important to look across all dimensions and also looking at those intersectionally, as Kamala mentioned as well.
Thank you. I appreciate the perspective there, and I think that gives us a foundation from which we can build on in our conversation today. You know, we know over time diversity initiatives have evolved from diversity and inclusion to now we have the component of equity in here. Many of us know that the belonging is another evolution and a component to inclusivity and equity. And some organizations have even flipped it, and they don't use the acronym DE&I. They use EDI, right? And they start with equity and putting that at the forefront. I'd love to hear from both of you, kind of from your perspective as practitioners and experts in this space, how you've watched the evolution of diversity initiatives over time, and kind of give us a roadmap to that journey. And Kamala, I think you may even have, kind of a roadmap that you've outlined in your work. If you could take us on that journey, that would be great.
Absolutely. So I'm kind of known for my tagline, which is belonging is more powerful than any strategy, right? So when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether it's DEI or DEIB, you often think about, okay, how do we create a strategy? What do we need to do to put this together to make it work? And I come from the lens of talking about belonging. So I always lead with how do we create a culture where people feel like we belong? So I start with the B. I'm one of those people who mixes up the letters. So I start BID. I start belonging, inclusion, and diversity, right? And so it's like a bid. I'm bidding you to look at your organization and look at your culture. And do people feel like they belong? How can I show up in this space? So if we're leading from thinking about diversity in the reverse, so almost starting with the end in mind, which would be, how do I create a culture where people feel like I belong? So then you're not really worrying about quotas and worrying about numbers and worrying about anti-racism and worrying about, I have to give certain people promotions or I have to hire so many of and fill in the blank. You start really thinking about belonging, because I'm sure all of us here who are on this webinar can attest to the feeling of wanting to know what it feels like to belong, and having been in a position where they have felt like they belonged, whether it be their partner, whether it be the school they chose, whether it be the job that they're in. So if we think about belonging, to me, as a springboard to lead into those areas around diversity, then it's a more inclusive term that everybody knows it's a feeling and it's something that we all want to feel. And if we feel that, then we can kind of move on to the next point. So I'm gonna kick over to Satrice and see how she can add on that.
Yeah, thanks for passing it over. And I think something that's really interesting is how we can talk about differences and similarities in these conversations. So historically, it was just diversity, right? And then gradually we saw diversity and inclusion. And then we started to see, oh, maybe it's inclusion and diversity. And then that E came in and it's DEI. And I will say, one difference between us is right now we use the term DEI. You saw our framework is DEIX at Mattingly Solutions, right? But what's funny about it is while we call ours DEI, and that's how we refer to it, our priority is belonging the same way Kamala's is. And we have this like equation that says D plus E plus I equals B. And it's not just about, do you have representation with your diversity? It's, do you have that representation? Do you have equitable policies and practices in place? Are your individuals using inclusive behaviors? And when you have all of that together, your employee, that's how it's answering the question, right? Is how do we make people belong? Well, we need all of these pieces of the puzzle. And so what I like to say when people get hung up on, is it D, E, I, B, J, A, whatever letter is getting tossed out there, and then the order of the letters doesn't really matter to me. Whatever your organization wants to use and whatever sticks and makes it easier for you to have conversations, that's fine. As long as the core message behind all of that is the right messaging. So that goes back to that original question, right? Of, it's not just about representation at one level. It's not just one piece of that pie. It's bringing all of that together to lead to this belonging and making an environment where your employees can truly thrive.
I love the way that both of you have framed this for us, because it takes us as organizations away from a compliance mindset and moves us into a culture mindset, and really focusing on the belonging and the culture. But Satrice, I know you've lived in this space where you've had to balance the culture with also data, right? And thinking, how do I infuse that to make wise choices? And somewhere in that intersection lives the compliance narrative that we're trying to move away from. Can you talk a little bit about your own journey, how you've reconciled kind of those pieces that maybe have tension within them for organizations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's funny because we hear that come up when people are talking about DEI. And so again, something that's slightly different is I do live in that land of strategy. And so it's about, with my IO background, a very big focus on collecting data up front. But when I say data, I mean that broadly, right? So that is collecting not just your diversity numbers to, like, oh, are you representative in these different identity groups, but also hearing the voice of the employee, because again, it's about their experience in your organization. So that's surveying them to hear their perspective, but that's also qualitative data. So doing some focus groups, interviews with your execs, right? Hearing everyone's voice, taking that data to then develop a roadmap of, all right, here are the areas we need to work on to get to that belonging, to get to that space where everyone can thrive. And that's the hard part, is getting people to see that all of that work we're doing is not just about, okay, we're going to do some trainings, or all right, we have EEOC compliance where we need to meet our affirmative action numbers. It's not that. There's so much more data you can and should be looking at. Yes, diversity, EEOC, that's even that isn't all of it. Let's just say that right now, make that very clear. EEOC may say you need to look at certain things, but they don't even break down gender, race, and ethnicity in the ways that has been researched as best practice to be the most inclusive. So even the pieces that are compliance are the bare minimum, and you could be going above and beyond that. So that's one of the things that as an external consultant I have to navigate in this space, is having that conversation with organizations and helping them see how compliance, again, is just the bare minimum. It's like a starting point if you don't have any other direction. But if you truly want to create that space, you need to go beyond that, build on that. I'll pass that over to Kamala, see if there's anything you want to add from your side.
Kamala, anything you wanted to add?
Thank you. I had to unmute myself. I just love what Satrice said when she mentioned the EOC, because I think that's a very reactive model. And having worked with them for a number of organizations and years, it's a very reactive model. So it is more towards compliance. So don't take that as the goal to make sure that you have met all the requirements of that governing federal agency, because then you're really at a reactive compliance mindset. And what we want to do is create a mindset around our culture and how people feel and how can they thrive within that culture. And that should always kind of be the aim.
I think that's a great segue into asking our viewers to respond to one of our poll questions, right? Let's put some data into this. So we know DE&I and B is complex, and that every organization is at a different place in their evolution and their own journey. And so, Kamala, would you like to talk to these 5 levels, and then maybe we can ask a poll question of our audience to see where each one of them are in the journey. But why don't you give us a little bit more color around these different stages? Absolutely.
So any organization for any area, we should be having some kind of benchmark, right? What are we measuring and how do we measure? So typically when we come to the DEI space, we often hear terms such as, I just don't get the candidates to apply, and I live in an area that's very rural, and what more can I do? I post the jobs, and so it's almost a sort of defeatist in terms of there's nothing I can do. But most CEOs and head of organizations are very, very driven by targets, and so are those underneath them. So we do know how to work towards targets and strategies. So I look at this as a benchmark, right? So when we think about DEI in the organization and workplace, we have to think about how do we make this part of the organization, right? This is not just HR's responsibility. This is not the DEI director's responsibility. This is our responsibility as an organization. So this is a kind of benchmark tool that I've created to around kind of testing the water, so to speak, in terms of who am I? What level do I fall under? And so we start very much basically at kind of level 1, where we are really, really kind of inactive. There isn't really having any work done. We've heard of D&I, and we think it's something that we're good. You know, we have a few mixture of nationalities here, and I think that, you know, we're okay. So we don't think that we need to make any improvements. And then we go up. And so it's really a benchmark model, and we should be benchmarking ourselves in terms of where is it that we wish to be. And I don't want to give away any kind of tricks right now and spoil the next piece too much, because I would like to talk about the ideal level that we should be at as an organization. But this really helps any organization and leaders to kind of look at and see, okay, so there are 5 levels, where do I want to be at? And again, you don't have to get there overnight. We can have a 2 to 3 year strategy around putting some tools in place to get to the level that is, you know, optimal. And we put a strategy in place to do that, whether it be through recruiting, whether it be through education, whether it be through holding our leaders responsible and accountable in their performance evaluations, to their commitment to diversity and inclusion. So there's a number of factors, but this really is a benchmarking tool for us to benchmark against where we are currently and where we'd hope to be. And so over to you, Cheryl. I'll turn you over to our next step.
Very good. Well, let's open up our poll then to our audience. Where would you say your organization is on this continuum that Kamala just outlined for us? We'll allow our attendees to vote here. We'll give it just a minute. All right, looks like we have some results, and this looks like a pretty good bell curve, doesn't it? That most of us in that proactive stage there, which is with a clear awareness of the value of D&I, but starting to implement some of that systematically across the organization. A good, 20% to 25% on either side of that proactive. So some being a little bit more progressive than others, but very few in the best practice space, and good to see that not as many in the inactive space as well. So Kamala, let's come back to that and let's start to unpack this a little bit more. And I'm going to start with you and help us start thinking through, like, what are some of the strategies that people can use and in their organization to move themselves along this continuum?
So great to see the results. There were a few in the proactive, a good number, which is great. That, what to me is saying that you're beginning a programmatic thrust, right? You're moving in a healthy direction, right? Healthy direction. I'm just going to kind of briefly go over the levels. I talked about level 1. Level 2 is that level that Satrice referred to in regards to the EOCs come down and you're kind of really making these changes and feeling good about yourself because, you know, they've given you a report and you fixed everything, right? That's a compliance mindset at best. And so what I would say to that is those actions are very just symbolic. You're showing a symbol of a reaction, and so you've taken some action, and now symbolically you're at that level, but it's a reactive. Level 3 proactive, I said you're beginning those programs. You're beginning to think about how can we incorporate it more, how can we educate, how can we involve the organization, and everybody should be thinking about how can I be at level 4. You want to be systematic and you also want to be robust. Okay, how can I have something that's robust and progressive? And so what I would say to kind of get to those levels are looking at involving everyone within the organization. So that goes down to, firstly, I will say, creating a strategy around diversity and inclusion, equity and belonging. What is our strategy and how do we want to get there? And often people, you know, they don't know where to start. And so that's where, you know, consultants come in, people like Satrice and myself, and also Catapult, to really help you navigate and draw a diagram to where it is that you say you want to be, but getting advice on what it would look like to have a more diverse and inclusive organization, recognizing that it takes time. Because again, think of that word robust. To be robust is kind of like fortitude. You need to take some time to kind of build those bricks and gain strength. And so that will, I will say, come in kind of baby steps. I think that starts off with, first of all, education, right? Offering education, again, not from a compliance, a video that gets sent around in an organization that everybody is, tasked with watching, but really splitting things into groups and focus groups and hearing from people. I always say doing culture surveys to kind of get to the root of how people are feeling. That's where you kind of gather your data that I'm sure Satrice can talk more about. But really, how do we gather some data to get the pulse of where we're at now so that we can get that robust, systematically organization where we can really show improved results? Because we want to poll where are we at now and where do we want to be in 2 to 3 years? Where do we want to be with our senior leadership, and what do we want that, and how do we want that to look like? What opportunities are there for those who are minorities and women and those who have some kind of disabilities? How are we getting it and creating a pipeline? And so that will take time to get a structure going, but that should be rolled out to the entire organization. That shouldn't be a secret for secret leadership who only know about it, but let's get buy-in. Those people who are new to the organization and those people who are interested in joining our organization. It's very, very important to highlight how much value that they have, and even your strategic plan. Satrice, do you want to add on that?
Yes, no, sorry, I'm struggling with that mute over there. No, that's really useful. And honestly, I was over here taking my own notes because we have a readiness model that we use that's kind of similar, but I love that as just a quick check-in. And I like the idea of doing that up front, because something that I've run into with organizations is sometimes they're completely inactive or maybe just reactive, but they think they're in the best practice slot. So sometimes it's important to just kind of slow down and check in on, all right, well, what have you done and where are you in shaping that picture of, again, going beyond the bare minimum. That's really the goal, because just doing that bare minimum piece, that's more for you to check that box, as people like to say, right, than you to actually committing to the work and that change. So I think that's incredible, and I took some notes. Thanks.
I'd like to thank you, Satrice. Bill, sorry, Cheryl, on what Satrice said very early on. I didn't talk about level 5, and it's interesting. Satrice mentioned people think they're at level 5. Level 5 is really global best practices. So, Satrice early on talked about that kind of global, and so most people think they're there because, again, they may have a few of people in different groups and feel that they can tick some boxes. But you're looking at what global practices around the world are with DEI and B. So that would kind of get you in that 5 best practices, which most of our organizations are not quite there yet. So sorry to interrupt you, Cheryl.
No, you're good. And I think, it lays a good perspective for us to see, while the poll was definitely a bell curve, it's natural that we should only have a smaller percentage in those really, truly global best practices. I want to come back to really the majority of our respondents, which was about 75% of them that were somewhere in that proactive, reactive, or inactive state. And we know, just through our work here, that sometimes it's not a lack of desire or a lack of willingness to want to do more. They don't know how necessarily, or there are perceived risks in doing something, and perhaps doing something the wrong way, that creates an inertia and a lack of willingness to want to go somewhere. And so I'd like, Abby, if you would show our mitigating risks slide here. And Satrice, maybe you could talk through this and tell us from your perspective, what do you think some of the risks are that organizations encounter, and work us through some of these solutions.
Yeah, so thanks for putting those up there. On the left there are a lot of concerns that I tend to hear when I'm talking to either people who want us to come in, or maybe once I'm getting in conversations with senior leaders. And the first one there up top is about just DEI is really divisive. It's going to break people apart. There's going to be a lot of backlash. If we focus on it, people aren't going to be happy about that work, right? So just negative. DEI work is not helpful. It's negative. And then the big one is the legal side, right? Ugh, if we do DEI work, we are gonna get sued. Once they know the truth, like, we're in some trouble. And then the next one there is a concern around capturing data. Either they think, whenever we collect any kind of data, our employees don't respond, they don't want to give us that information anyways, or we don't even have people that match, underrepresented identities. We're all the same. So why are we collecting data from anyone? Like, we can't even hear the voices of these people you're talking about because those people don't exist. And then the last one there is kind of wrapping it all up and tying it all together is, DEI is going to point out all of these issues, and that's it. Again, it's just causing more problems, but not giving us anything useful. And these are a lot of common concerns that I hear, and they all honestly come down to fear, right? It's fear of what this work does for the organization, and it's the fear of the negative. But there's a lack of looking at the positive, right? So let's go into the solution side, and looking at
Hey, Sir
how
Therese, do you want
yeah,
to do a quick poll before you do the
sure.
solutions? That
Yeah,
might
let's
be good to just see where people are on some of these concerns.
yeah.
Do our organizers have that poll ready they could throw up? Okay, very good. So let's see. So Therese just went through a number of the things that she hears, but we want to hear from you in our audience. What do you think are challenges that create risk for your companies when it comes to DE&I? And then when we see this, Sir Therese can give us some of the solutions. So poll in progress. All right, we're getting close. Okay, so Therese, you have your answers, which I think will help you go through some of these solutions. So, 3/4 of our respondents saying that they think that they will identify problems that don't have solutions, which is kind of where you ended. But almost half of our group is concerned about the divisiveness that might result from it. So with this poll in mind, I'm going to come back to you and let you talk a little bit about some of our solutions, and we'll get that slide back up for you.
Yeah, no, thanks. And that's really useful to see, and honestly not surprising. So that makes a lot of sense. And we can talk about the first one there on the list just because it's at the top and also was our second highest. And the importance there is going back to something I said very early on, right? When we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging, access, it's not just about one identity, right? It's not, honestly, the fear comes down to, again, it's not just anti-racism. That is a part of it. In your organization, after you look into everything, maybe that is the biggest conversation for you. But checking in other places. I've actually went in before and people thought that was their biggest issue, but once we looked into their data, it wasn't even the top of the list. That wasn't where they were seeing a lot of the concerns. And so making sure that you are listening to all your employees, no matter their identity, and getting that information and using it to bring your employees together, and that they can treat each other, because inclusion, right, it's behaviors, it's how these people are treating each other, and to make people feel like they belong, everyone has a role. And so making them see that, making them see their role, and that it's not about like, creating these fault lines between people. It's about how can we all support each other, and give people the opportunity so everyone has a chance to succeed. So that's one of the things there. It's really just how are you framing that work, making sure that you're covering all of your bases, looking at all identities and looking at them intersectionally as well. We'll always come back to that piece, going more than just that one layer down, going 2, maybe even 3 layers down if possible. Sorry again about this lighting, but we'll click through. Actually, if you just want to click through and show them all, I'd like to touch on that last one and kind of tie it to the ones above, and because it relates so well to the top as well. It's not just about, again, identifying those issues. So yes, you have to look at your data, you have conversations, you are looking for problems, right? That is the point where, like, where are we lacking? Sure, that is the starting point. But the real work are the solutions. It's going beyond just saying, hey, we got some data, we saw we're really slacking on X, Y, and Z. Thanks for coming. Like, that was great. No, it's okay, here's that data. And then this is again tying into above to help you collect that data as well. When you're transparent about why you're collecting this information and what you hope to accomplish with it, and then once you collect that data, again, being transparent with the potential actions, you're more likely to hear more voices. So you'll collect data once. Let's say you don't have that trust, your employees don't respond. Usually it's because they think their voice doesn't matter. Once you start acting on it, they're like, oh snap, they actually did something with that survey data. So then the next round, when you collect more data, they're like, all right, I'm going to participate because I want them to hear my voice. I want them to do what I need. And so it may take time. Trust doesn't come overnight, but it's important when you're capturing that data to be transparent in your purpose, and then again communicating through every phase. So communicating up front the purpose, communicating when you collect the data, communicating when you have the findings, and communicating again those actions. Action is key. So if there's any keywords on this slide, it's transparency, communication, and action. And then I will touch just very briefly on the legal side, because I know there were some people who fell into that category. And the fun one for me there is this fear that you're going to be sued if you collect the data and you have it as proof. It's not really happening from what I've seen in my experience and all of the other practitioners I've talked to. It's not like, yeah, once you put those hard numbers down, you're getting sued every day. It's actually the opposite. A lot of times, again, your employees, they're like, man, you are finally listening to my voice. Think to your own experience, right? You're in your organization. It's not fun to job hunt. You like kind of being where you are, and if they're willing to make the changes so you can be happy and get what you need, your employees are like, all right, we can make this work. If you're going to put in the effort, we can put in the effort and come together. That's what we tend to see is when I go in and I'm collecting data, the employees immediately are like, I'm just glad we're doing something. I'm hopeful that it leads to action. If it leads to action, that's amazing. That's their fear, right? Their fear is the lack of action. Their immediate thought isn't, I'm going to use this as a tool against the organization. So that's one thing that I've seen. And also, again, what's kind of funny is there's this fear of what can happen with the data, but more often than not, sometimes your data may show that things aren't that bad. And so it's actually helpful for you to have it. And you can say, so your employees may either one, know what your issues are, whether you collect the hard numbers or not, or two, they may be assuming there are issues where there aren't. And so once you have that data, you can say, hey, actually, we do have diverse leadership. That's an example I've seen before. They thought, oh, they're all white men, when really they were mostly women. And that was the employee's concern. And so being able to show that was really helpful in itself. And then one last final thought on the legal side. I'm not a lawyer, so this is not official legal advice, but very, very basic. Again, going back to compliance, a lot of times the fear are those discrimination lawsuits. And really, for better or for worse, the legal system is more on the side of the organization. And as long as you're showing good faith effort, that you're trying to improve things, that's a good case for you. So the thing that people fear, collecting the data, is actually the thing that would help you most if you ever ran into a lawsuit. So even whether you collect the data up front or not, if you run into those issues, you're still going to have to do all this work. So again, it's better to be proactive, collect that data, and tie it to action. The action is key. You have to show what you're doing about it. Don't just collect the data. You're going to be better off than not having that in your bag. So transparency, communication, action, keywords there. And then I'd love to hear, Camilla, your thoughts. I know looking at this and any conversations you've had along these lines with clients.
Thank you so much. Now, the action piece is, again, I agree that any organizations that I've supported and consulted for, the employees always feel that they give all this input and it just goes into a black hole. And so nothing moves beyond the conversation starting point. And everybody's really excited to kind of share and be open and honest and transparent. And then I think there's almost a fear of overwhelmment, of I don't know what to do, so nothing is done. And it's often sat upon. And so that, I think, is where you really lose faith. Whereas if people understand that you are struggling, because I will say the DI is not a destination, right? It is not a destination. You will never be done. And that's okay. You continue the journey, right? And so when people see that you are willing to do that and willing to take that hard walk, they have a little bit more empathy versus, gaining their trust and not moving on it. So it's a journey. Give yourself some grace and know that you're working towards a goal that is a long, never-ending road.
Yeah, I want to add on that real quick, just because, so you hear that all the time, right? It's, and I say it too, the old DEI isn't a destination, it's a journey. But when I think about it sometimes, in the fact that people think, yeah, we're just going to do these couple of things, done and dusted, right? I think to the rest of your organization. Would you ever say that with your marketing? Like, yeah, we put out one campaign, done, bring it in, or would you think about that with designing products, right? Like, okay, we designed one thing, we're never going to change it, we're never going to look at it again, that's going to get us where we need to go. Why would DEI be any different? It is a part of your organization, it's ingrained throughout your organization, and things are going to change over time. It's also, honestly, it's a social construct, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Again, if we think back to how it's evolved over the years, if we were still only talking about it the way we talked about it a year ago, 5 years ago, 50 years ago, right? It doesn't look anything like it looks today, and that's okay. It's because it's not just something that lives in this vacuum in your organization, something that's happening in your local, immediate local community, your state, your region, your country, and then even globally, as we mentioned. So it's definitely something, again, it makes me laugh when people are like, oh yeah, we're going to be done, because you don't treat any other piece of your organization like that. And this should be the same.
Particularly technology. I was going to say, technology in organizations, we upgrade, our IT, our phones on a regular basis when anything, any new information comes out that can enhance and improve our kind of work life and ease and help to keep our calendars synced. Great, we're ready to invest. And that's the same mentality that we need to take around this area, because there are new trends, there are new pieces of information, just like our technology, and we're very committed to making sure that we have the best, and we're up there with that. We also have to do that on the same journey. That's the kind of analogy I always use.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it takes us back to the B, right? It takes us back to the belonging. And when you talk with organizations and HR professionals and the C-suite of organizations, they need people to enable and grow their business and their organization, right? Make them more competitive, make them stand out in a crowded marketplace. And that comes down to a sense of belonging and how you're bringing individuals into your organization to help advance the organization forward, having that diversity of thought, have that diversity of experience, have all of those pieces that create an opportunity to advance the organization. So I'm going to pick on a couple words that both of you said here and move us into the action phase, right? So Therese, you said you've got to have action here. And so I know a number of our attendees are probably thinking, all right, so this is great. Yes, we recognize we're there, we're ready. Like, let's take us to the action and the strategies. And yet they may not have an organization that has all the tools and resources at their disposal right now. So let's talk about developing a DE&I strategy. And with that, I'd love for us to talk about the people aspect, the recruiting side of how do you get people into your organization when you may not particularly have a diverse organization. And so you're building that as you're recruiting. How do you retain when you get diverse thinkers and diverse perspectives into the organization? How do you retain that so you can continue in the journey? And then, that kind of all leads to culture. So I'm going to tee that up as our next point of discussion. And maybe we can start with kind of an overall strategy. How do you set that using your baseline data, knowing that some of our organizations may not have, really proud data to build upon that? So, Therese, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So as far as building a strategy, there are a lot of resources out there. There are a lot of consultants out there that can help you along that path and interpreting your data, because there isn't one blanket statement. So that would be my recommendation, is don't just look for what's like, this one list of things that you do to get started, because that may not be what's best for your organization. It's really important to start with your own data and environment and needs, and looking at your industry and the stage of your company and things like that to build out that strategy, which I know isn't the ideal answer. You're hoping I had this like magic thing that you could just do and say, yep, this is how you should move forward. But really, it's taking that that personalized approach is the best way forward with your strategy. But I will say, as far as, you know, for those organizations that maybe aren't starting out very diverse, or maybe your industry isn't diverse and you're trying to think, what do we do as far as that recruiting piece and how are you getting people in? I'm actually going to flip the order of how you listed it. And it's creating that environment that's going to help you retain employees first. So I would not recommend worrying about getting people in the door until you have a place where they're willing to stay. Because if you are bringing people in, but you don't have the foundation where they're ready and able to succeed, then you're not going to keep them. So you're going to stay stuck in that phase. So a lot of people like to focus on the recruitment part, especially because right now, right, there's the war on talent and everybody's trying to fight for like getting people in. Well, make sure you have somewhere where they want to go, and then that's going to help you with that issue. So that goes into, like I said, looking at your strategy, finding out from using the voice of your employees. That's honestly one of the best ways to build a strategy, because they're there, they know what they want, they know what makes them happy. Ask them, ask your employees, what can we do to make this a better place to work? And then put those things in place. And then you can broadcast that, right? And say like, hey, here's all the things that are happening in our organization. That goes back to that transparency and communication. And that's a really good starting point for being able to retain, because when employees feel like their voices are being heard, so that feeling of belonging, valued, respected, seen, and heard, and also opportunities is a big piece, and that ties into that equity piece. So they have the opportunity to take part in different pieces of the organization. They have the opportunity to be promoted and move forward in the organization. Once they have all of that, and you have that environment, they're more likely to stay. Because if they don't have that, that's again when people are leaving, that's when you're having turnover. And so once you have that resolved, that's when you're like, all right, let's use that to get people in. And two sides on the recruiting piece, and then I'm gonna pass it over to Kamala and see what she wants to add. But when it comes to the recruitment side, in my opinion, there's two pieces. One is sometimes there isn't really a pipeline issue. People like to use, oh, there's no pipeline. You're just not looking in the right places. So put in the effort, reach out to your Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and see what you can do there and advertise there. Look out in your industry and find those organizations. Like, for instance, I'm an IO psychologist. There's one I'm a part of called Blacks in IO. You can post job ads there if you're trying to improve like your Black representation. There are other things like that in industries all over that you can lean into. Or even going into school. So HBCUs, if you just want fresh grads coming out, even develop an internship program with HBCUs where they could then turn into a full-time employee, right? There's so many things you could do to just find the pipeline that already exists. But then the other side of that coin is, let's say there truly is a pipeline issue, put in some work to fix the pipeline. What are you waiting for? You're a part of this, right? And that's your corporate social responsibility, right? Like that's getting out into the community around you, working with schools. You could go into elementary schools, build something in your local neighborhood, right? To have something set up and help with that pipeline. Or let's say you're like, we don't have the time and capacity for that. Fine, build a sponsorship with something that already exists. For example, Girls That Code, right? You're trying to get more female coders. Sponsor them, give them more opportunities, let them do the work, but then that's still helping you get more people in that pipeline and potentially into your organization. So I'm gonna pause there, pass it over, see what you want to add.
You did a great job there, Satrice. I'll only add a few areas, but yes, I too do not have a magic wand. However, my first thing that I will say is, what's your why, right? Why is it even important? So we're always kind of thinking about how can we do this and how can we quickly have a quickly way to increase DEI and B in our organization, but why? So knowing what your why is will translate to everyone else in your organization. So first, I would say there's some self-identification into really analyzing, going back to my continuum, like, is it compliance? Is it something you're getting pressure from? What is the why behind why you think it's needed and important? Financially, put some money towards DEI. You want to make all these changes, but there's no budget, right? Anything that is going to be able to be successful will need to have some kind of financial backing behind it. So allocate a budget. And the other thing I will say is start small, right? There's, if you're at a point where you've been at that level one where there's nothing, right? Let's not go with these kind of grandiose ideas. Let's start small. And it's building bricks, right? Starting off with something small that we can do, Teresa's mentioned around recruiting, right now it's very, very common. Everybody is aware of HBCUs, and I say that's one great resource, right? One great resource, because it's like the only resource that you ever, I'm hearing all the time, oh, should I advertise with an HBCU? There are so many other great universities and colleges who are also well known for their diversity, right? FAU happens to be one of them. There's about 10 around the country that you can kind of keenly reach out to and say, hey, I want to develop some partnerships. We really want to encourage people to come to work for our organization. And how do people know that you're even interested? How are you really attracting and engaging the communities that you wish to, those who are less able, the LGBTQ? How are you going out and taking the time to engage so that they know, yes, that you really want me to be part of your organization? I go back to belonging and really spending some time thinking about yourself as a leader, that time in your life where you didn't feel like you belonged, right? Every single one of us here, it's such an awful, uncomfortable feeling. Like, we know when we didn't belong and we weren't quite selected, and it's really awkward, and do they really see me? And so when we think about that space, that should really help us think about the kind of organization and culture that we want to create. That starts to lead off to thinking about, okay, I want people to feel like this when they come here. I want people to feel like they can show up as their authentic self, and their ideas will be, you know, we hire people, oh my gosh, you're so creative, and you know, I've read your resume, or we've headhunted someone who we knew was fabulous and made great changes, and then sometimes we bring them in and we don't embrace that creativity, right? We want to squash it. So the same thing that you were recruiting me for, now you want me to assimilate to kind of how this organization is. So I can't show up as myself. You want me to be another clone. You liked what I did, but you're not willing for me to use it. So again, really thinking about how do people want to feel within the organization, and then putting some money, making small, getting buy-in from the entire organization. Everybody should know when you are doing your recruiting and onboarding, why is diversity important? Why does it matter to our organization? So that when you start off, it's not something that's an afterthought. It's very much, I call it like the fiber that's weaved through, just like a rug in the organization, like any other piece, like finance, like, you know, when we discuss how much increases or bonuses, we want to make sure that DI is not a side on, because again, D&I adds value, right? And so it should be very much an integral core part of our organization. So that's my piece.
Yeah, I want to do one just quick like thread through all of that, and it's being intentional. This doesn't happen like by accident or you know, like mistake, especially in those places where you are already lacking, right? You have to intentionally think of everything, to everything that I said, everything that Kamala said. It takes you intentionally taking the time to put in the resources, the money, just the thought space, you know, to see those things happen. It's so, because I'm thinking again back to a conversation I had with someone. Well, I have nothing against people. Anyone can succeed here. Anyone's welcome. Like, isn't that enough? Like, well, you just told me all the other issues you're running into, so it's not enough, right? You have to do something, and you have to be intentional about it if you want to see some progress. So just wanted to kind of tie that up with a bow.
There's some small key things before you finish, Latrice, that can be done in the very beginning. Let's looking at your policies. How inclusive are they, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I'm wanting and if I'm interested in your organization, you know, is it family friendly? Is there flexible working? Will I be embraced if I'm a carer for a relative or a family member? So those are things that you can start doing right now, is really reviewing, or have someone review how inclusive are our policies. And again, that's not something that we should leave for sort of 5 to 10 years. It's something every few years, keep reviewing. Data's changing, things are changing. Let's make sure that we are moving with the times and making sure that we're increasing and making those changes in our policies also.
Yeah.
You've both given such great things really around attracting and retaining diverse and inclusive thinking in the workplace. And, you know, we didn't even get to talk about things like tapping into your existing population. If you have employee resource groups or affinity groups that exist already in your workplace, what a great source of data and internal perspective on why those individuals are staying in your organization, and then leveraging those networks to continue to go out and and do the full circle, as you said, Certrice. You know, it's around creating a culture and a place where people feel valued and can belong, that then allows the recruiting strategies to be that much easier. The one piece we haven't talked about, but I do think is important in the DE&I conversation, though, is around kind of sponsorship, right? It's one thing to have a seat at the table. It's another thing to have advocates when you are not at the table. And, you know, oftentimes we call those sponsors or champions or advocates in an organization. And now there's this new terminology, right, that everyone's kind of getting their arms around, allyship. And what is allyship? And how does that intersect with this DE&IB conversation? Certrice, I know you put together kind of a few slides here for us to help us all understand the next evolution of that and how the conversation continues when those in the room aren't in the room. Would you like to walk us through that before we do our last poll?
Yeah, sure. So allyship here, as you can see, it's a partnership. I think that's something that people overlook when they talk about allyship. Often when you hear it, it's often very ally focused. And that's where people get into this concern of, you know, if we just focus on the ally side, then it's how helpful is that, right? Are we just catering to that person who wants to feel better and useful? So it's this partnership between an ally and their partner, and they're working toward that shared goal of fairness, justice, and equity. And so then to break that down a little further, what you're seeing on the left, it's that allies are using their power and status that they have to support and advocate for someone who doesn't share a key part of their identity. So, you know, examples of that you usually hear are like men being allied to a woman, or white to black, or, you know, straight to LGBTQ community, or so on. And so there's so many ways there, but what I like to dig deeper into is those roles could reverse depending on the organization. And so it's not just saying that it's always that way for an ally partner relationship. And it also could be intersectional. So a white woman being an ally to a black woman, right? And so looking at those different pieces there, women basically can be allies for each other is the point. And so breaking down into that partnership piece more is this slide here. And so an ally should be someone who is curious, right? They're willing to learn about people who are different from them. They have some humility. They understand that they don't know everything and they're not always going to get it right. And they're willing to hear that feedback instead of getting defensive. They're like willing to learn, again, going back to that curiosity. And then they have courage, because being an ally isn't about you being comfortable. It's about you, again, working towards that goal with your partner. And that may mean sometimes you're putting your own job on the line. You're putting yourself in an uncomfortable position to speak up on someone else's behalf, either if you see something happening that isn't right, or that you're speaking up trying to get them an opportunity that maybe you wanted too, you know? So whatever that may be, it's you supporting that person, and that takes some courage. On the other side, the partner, again, we can't forget the partner. You have an important role in this. The partner, you need to be self-aware enough to know what it is that you need. So when you're working with this partner or with this ally, you can tell them, hey, this is how you can support me. This is exactly what I need. So they're not guessing and just saying, this is what I'm going to do for you in your career. No, you have a voice in that conversation. But there's also some trust. I know it can be very hard and uncomfortable to tell someone, I need help. And so you have to have that trust and be willing to work with that person. And then the last key piece there is a bias for action. So you're getting the support from that ally. It's being ready to act. When that opportunity comes up, you're going to show up to the plate and like take it. You know, you're gonna take that seat at the table and you know, make it your own. So it's kind of broken out like that, but I also want to say that both allies and partners may have or should have pieces from the other list as well. So this is a good way of how I talk about allyship in general. Do also want to call out that this does overlap. You know, you may see this happening with a mentor. You may see this happening with a sponsor. Typically, that's another question, is how are those two different? And mentors are more so, you know, they're just there to give advice to their mentee. Whereas a sponsor, they're there, again, to truly advocate for that person. They're there to bring up their name when they're not in a room, get them opportunities, get them in front of the right people so they can succeed. I'm going to pause that because I know we're running short on time, and I'm going to pass it over back to you all.
Great. Kamala, is there anything that you would like to, I'd like to give you kind of the last word on this around the whole piece of culture, right? The recruiting, the retention, the allyship, and bringing that full circle to a culture that celebrates, promotes, and engages individuals in building this journey to get to that level 5 organization. So let me give you kind of the last word before we wrap up with our final poll.
Thank you. Well, just to kind of piggyback a little bit on what Satrice talked about in terms of allies, I really have to talk about how can we amplify voices, right? We've talked about strategies and ways. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about amplifying voices. But again, these are things that don't require a budget. What they require is courage. And they also require an acknowledgement that most of us, if we're honest, have had somebody who's been our sponsor in life, right? Satrice and myself were selected for a reason. Somebody, heard about us, our work, and have enabled us to kind of be here to speak with you. So how can you be a sponsor to somebody and changing the mindset? Because I often get to hear, well, I had to work my way up and I had to go through this to get to, everybody should do the same thing. And again, I kind of remind individuals that sometimes your name was spoken in a room that you weren't in. There was a meeting that someone said, oh my gosh, Satrice is amazing. You got to reach out to her. She does a phenomenal job, right? She wasn't even there. So how can you use opportunities to amplify the voices of those underrepresented groups which are not at the table? Some ways that you can do that I've worked with organizations are sometimes people, they don't get to have face-to-face time with CEOs, right? So you can do something where it's quarterly, where somebody can come and report out on their area, even if it's not something that's traditionally done, to give them that face-to-face with the CEO. Also take it as your responsibility as a leader to speak as a leader at the table about those individuals who typically would never be spoken about, right? So that again, people are being made aware of their impact and how they're contributing to the organization. So if we can think about how we can invite and create opportunities for people to attend leadership meetings, investing in middle management, and be an encourager and create strategies to enable those who are quiet, perhaps, and less, out there with their voices to really be heard. I call it sharing the air and that space that you have to also really amplify their voices. But I recognize we only have a few minutes left, so I'll pause there. Thank you.
We could go on for hours, couldn't we? We knew that going into this, and we knew we were packing a lot into the conversation. As we start our wrap up, I want to put a final poll up for our participants to look at this as we're talking about this. There is no silver bullet. You heard both Kamala and Satrice say that neither one of them had a silver bullet or the magic answer in how do you solve diversity, equity, inclusion. We know that there are a lot of elements that go into a strategy, and so we would love to hear from our attendees what you would value most from Catapult as you start to move your organizations along this continuum from the inactive all the way up to the best practice and progressive conversations. So these are some of the things: learning and development courses. We do offer a bi-monthly DE&I roundtable that is open to our members. We have consulting for organizations. We offer fractional HR, which is interim support for key roles if you need someone to come in and provide interim leadership in an area. And then we didn't even get to pay equity, but that's a component of a DE&I strategy, looking at compensation and total rewards. So it looks like for many of you, the learning and development courses is number one. So thank you for participating in our poll. We do have learning and development courses available for our members. Even for our non-members, those can come on site at your organization. You can take a public class, and we do have hybrid classes as well that blend the best of in-person with hybrid learning. Would encourage you to look at our website for upcoming opportunities to participate in that. Please email us here if we can help you as well. Also, we'll put a plug in for diversity as defined by age and new perspective for interns. I know both Kamala and Satrice talked about tapping into the college populations, particularly in the HBCUs. If you snap a picture here of this QR code, Catapult has launched a new intern leadership program, which provides the wraparound services around belonging and culture for interns, so that they can be successful in your workplace, even if you don't have a strategy fully baked right now. So you can grab that. Today's webinar has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit here. The recording and the credit information will be emailed to all of you within the next 48 hours so that you can earn the credit for today. And then we'd like to invite you to continue to join us for our Thinking Differently series in May and June. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Just like DE&I, mental health needs to be integrated across the organization. So we'll be talking about mental health in the workplace on May, is it May 10th, I think, or May 12th? Anyway, that's on our website. And then the next
May 10th,
one.
that's a typo.
May 10th, thank you, Abby. May 10th, addressing mental health in the workplace. June 14th, building your culture. You can pick up on the best practices we talked about today here. And then if your organization is interested in our signature employment and labor law conference in the middle of May, there's an option to attend that both virtually and in person in our Raleigh office. So email our events team at meeting@letscatapult.org if you have any questions, suggestions for future programs. Links are in the chat, and we thank Kamala for joining us, Certrice for joining us today. Really appreciate all of your wisdom. We'll see you all next time. Have a great day.